Political scientists describe Mexico as democratic after 2000 because that is when the PRI and its vast network of patronage and clientelism was first dislodged from the presidency. The democratic political regime initially established by the Mexican Revolution remains in place today. One of the political institutions that exist within Mexico today is the Constitution. The Constitution of 1917 calls for a presidential, legislative, executive system. This means the separation of the judicial, executive, and legislative powers. Even though the separation of powers was created to keep all of the powers in check, Mexican presidents have enjoyed near dictatorial powers with few checks on their authority. The executive branch today has full authority over the judicial branch and even has the power to appoint state governors. For the longest time in Mexican history, the PRI party ruled over the state. It managed to do this by appointing favorable candidates into office within the federal and regional governments. However, its growing illegitimacy as a result of a deteriorating economy and PRI's disregard for the rule of law led to the opposition party winning. In order to polish its image, PRI made reforms favoring the opposition party. They also made an electoral law where the opposition must be present in the legislature. Some other institutions which exist within Mexico are the branches of government. The branches of government include the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The executive branch is considered the most powerful as the authority of the president is unchallenged within Mexico. Thus, Mexican presidents are viewed as elected monarchs. Some powers of a Mexican president include introducing legislation to Congress, the power to veto without it being overridden, the power to decree legislation, and the power to appoint cabinet members on his own. Until 1994, Mexican presidents had extensive power to appoint and remove judges. The requirements for being a president are that the candidate must be at least 35 years old and below 65 years of age. He or she can only serve one 6-year term, and they must also be citizens of Mexico. Mexican presidents appoint and preside over a large cabinet of ministers who deal with various government departments. The Secretary of Government and the Secretary of the Treasury have become the most high-profile cabinet posts in recent years. These posts are often stepping stones to presidency. Since 2000, the year of Vicente Fox's victory, the Mexican president has not been able to attain a majority in Congress. As a result, some of the constitutional checks on presidential power that were long absent in the Mexican system have been more effective. Mexico has a bicameral legislature called the National Congress. It is made up of the lower house, known as the Chamber of Deputies, and an upper house known as the Senate. The Chamber of Deputies has 500 members and has the power to pass laws with a simple majority vote, the power to levy taxes, and the power to verify the outcomes of the elections. Mexico's Senate is composed of 128 members, 3 senators from each state as well as the Federal District of Mexico City, and an additional 32 senators from each state from a national list on the basis of proportional representation. The upper house has the power to confirm the president's appointments to the Supreme Court, approve treaties, and approve federal intervention in state matters. The Mexican legislature is currently in transition. Until 1998, the PRI regularly won 95% of lower house seats and never lost a Senate seat. Between 1970 and 2003, it averaged 66.9% of the seats in the lower house, which outshined the presence of its rival, PAN. PAN averaged 17% during that period. In 1997, the two main opposition parties were able to form a coalition and take control over the lower house. In the December of 2018, another relatively new party known as the Morena destroyed the PRI and PRD. Its main opposition is the PAN. Mexico's judiciary is structured according to the U.S. model. Like the United States, Mexico has a national Supreme Court justice. It also has courts at the local and state levels. There are 11 Supreme Court justices who are appointed by the president. These appointments are confirmed by a 2/3 majority vote from the Senate. In Mexico, Supreme Court justices are limited to 15-year terms. During the 1980s, dramatic changes were introduced to give the Supreme Court greater power. The Supreme Court as of now can determine the constitutionality of legislation upon the request of 1/3 of the lower house. However, the Supreme Court can strike down a law if a supermajority of 8 out of the 11 justices agree. Reforms have increased the independence of the judiciary by creating a 7-member Federal Judicial Council to oversee the administration of justice. Like the legislature, Mexico's judicial system is currently in a transition. A number of amendments and reforms after 2000 have led to significant changes. The Mexican judicial system has also moved on from a European-style inquisitorial system to an oral-based jury model by 2016. Given the lack of resources and training, many government officials believe that the new reforms allowed criminals to go free. Mexico will have to retrain its lawyers and judges, but once implemented, the reforms will hopefully lead to a more transparent and effective legal system. During the last 2 decades of PRI rule, elections were widely viewed as corrupt. In the 1988 election, more than 30,000 ballot boxes disappeared. In order to escape criminalization, the government declared the final ballots as a state secret. In 1996, PRI under pressure created an independent federal electoral institute. This institute took power away from the government-controlled Secretary of Government. It also created the Federal Electoral Tribunal to judge all electoral disputes. These reforms made Mexican elections a little bit more reliable than before. Voting is obligatory in Mexico, but the rule is not regularly enforced by the government. The aforementioned rule and PRI's influence over electoral turnout led the PRI to have a majority of the votes. Now the situation has changed due to recent reforms. Mexican presidents are directly elected. In the first round, the candidate must receive a majority of the votes. This has meant that all recent elections have produced presidents with a relatively small plurality of the vote. Also, the legislature presently has been dominated by the opposition. A mixed electoral system exists for the lower house in Mexico. It consists of 300 single-member districts and 200 proportional representation seats. Deputies in the lower house serve 3-year terms. In the upper house, senators serve 6-year terms, and 3 are elected from each state and the federal district. The party with the most votes wins 2 Senate seats, and the party placing second is given the 3rd seat. An additional 32 seats are allocated for proportional representation. Elections of the Senate take place during the same time as the presidential elections. Parties must get at least 2% of the national vote in order to win seats from proportional representation lists. Mexico's electoral law also has provisions that make it difficult for a party to win a majority of the seats in either house of the legislature. A party's total number of seats in the lower house cannot exceed the percentage of the party's proportional representation vote by more than 8%. In order to gain a majority in the legislative branch, a party would need to get at least 42% of the proportional representation vote, and then win a large number of single-member competitions to push the total number of seats over 50%. Even though Mexico is federal on paper, it operated like a unitary state during PRI's authoritarian rule. Note, now it operates much more like a federal state. Excessive localism and a history of instability caused the absence of a strong central authority. This gave space for the PRI to come into a power vacuum and take full advantage of the situation. Until recently, the central government controlled every aspect of Mexico. Mexico currently has 31 states and a federal district of Mexico City. Each has its own constitution and a unicameral legislature. States are divided into municipios, similar to county governments in the United States. All of the officials within the regional governments are directly elected. Like the U.S. model, Mexican states and localities have their own police forces, but these forces have been widely viewed as corrupt. Since 2006, local police have been replaced in some areas by federal forces to annihilate corruption. Local police, local governments, and local drug traffickers have been found to be working together for the interest of drug lords in exchange for money. Even after all of this corruption in the municipios, Mexicans have greater confidence in their local governments than in the federal government itself.